Hi Year 12, welcome back. It's only going to be a short one from me today because most of the work that I need you to do for this revision session is going to be independent work that I'll send you separately. So hopefully this YouTube video won't last too long. So for today's revision session, we're going to be focusing on the character of James I and his disputes with Parliament. So when we're thinking about a dispute, this word can sometimes confuse students a little bit. They can assume that the word dispute means fight or war or rebellion, that kind of thing, when actually we don't really see any of that during James's reign. So instead, the word dispute, when we're thinking about James's relationship with his parliaments, instead we're thinking about the disagreements he had with parliaments, the arguments, but also what they were competing and what they were striving for and why that caused dispute, how their aims didn't quite match up, how they were often miscommunicated with each other, and then that led to further disputes. That's what we're focusing on today. And I don't know if you remember this was back in 2019 when Boris Johnson was given a telling off for proroguing Parliament, and that was later deemed to have been illegal, and when it went to trial, it was deemed that Boris Johnson's actions, he had not worked in a legal manner, and when the documents were being read out in court, this sentence was used. So this original sentence had been used in 1611 when an MP was discussing James and his use of royal prerogative and constitutional monarchy, and Coke articulated what had become and is still the foundational principle of the constitutional monarchy that we are a part of today. Coke said about James, "The king hath no prerogative but what the law of the land allows him." And the same thing was said about Boris Johnson, but obviously not with the word king, it was the word prime minister. The prime minister hath no prerogative but what the law of the land allows him. Essentially, what that means is, although James saw himself as a monarch that in some respects was untouchable, worked by the idea of divine right of kings, of the royal prerogative, actually, in terms of constitutional monarchy and the way that our parliament and our royal family works, the king does not have that prerogative but what the common law allows him to use. So even though James thought and acted as though he was above the law sometimes, on paper, in accordance to our constitution, that is not the law. King hath no prerogative by what the law of the land allows him. So the first thing I want you to do, you're not going to be able to see this, but it's fine because it goes over two sides anyway. So I will send you this reading separately. This talks about the character of James I in a little bit more detail. Obviously, we talk about James's character quite often because that plays a really important role in some of the policies that he enforces during his reign. And obviously, James has a slightly more obscure side to his personality than we see with previous monarchs, in the sense that he had favourites, male favourites, he was bisexual and that kind of thing. So obviously we talk about that in previous sessions, but we don't really delve into into James's upbringing and obviously the impact of his mother's actions and what impact that had on him, because it definitely played a part. So it's important that you do know a little bit about James's background and how these different events shape him into the person that he becomes and the king that he becomes. So pause me now and give this information a read for me, please. Okay, so what I think is important to stress is that when we think of dissolving parliaments and ruling alone and ruling without parliament, we think of Charles. We don't think of James. But actually, if you look at this information here, during his reign, James only calls Parliament 4 times. So actually, that is a very small amount of time, especially when you look at the years in which they ran for. So it can be quite easy for us to think of Charles as being an absolute monarch who ruled without Parliament, who sent them away for 11 long years. But actually, in the first 4 years of Charles's reign, he calls Parliament 3 times just in the first 4 years, whereas James only calls them 4 times throughout his entire reign. So I think that's important to stress so we can get it into perspective. You wouldn't necessarily need to know the names of these parliaments. These are the names that were awarded to them. Sometimes they're awarded at the time, or sometimes they're awarded a little bit later after the parliament has been dissolved. But I think it's important to try to match up the dates with other key things that we know were going on during the time period. So the first parliament was known as the Blessed Parliament, and that ran from 1604 to 1611. So we know that during that time, this was very early on in James's reign, he was very much trying to find his feet in terms of finances and policy as well. Obviously during this time period here, you have things like the gunpowder plot, the Buy, the Main plot, and things like that that obviously take quite an important lead. The next is the Aidled Parliament. If you refer to somebody as aidled, it means it doesn't work, it's broken, it's naff. And this is in 1614, and it runs from the 5th of April to the 7th of April, hence why James dubbed it the Aidled Parliament, because nothing was achieved. They only sat for a matter of days before James runs out of patience with them, and then finally dissolves them officially in June. So technically the Aidled Parliament is only alive for 8 weeks. It only meets literally a few times before James gets fed up with them and dissolves them. During this time period, James attempts to rule without Parliament from 1614 to 1621, so that's quite a gap, really, if you think about it, considering, again, Charles is plagued with the 11-year tyranny. This isn't too dissimilar from that, really. And then obviously you've also got to remember that during this time period here, this is obviously the Parliament is dominated by the 30 Years' War and James's intervention with the 30 Years' War, which is why James needs to call Parliament. And then finally the Happy Parliament, probably named because James was nearing the end of his life by this point, 1624 to 1625 before James dies, dissolved on death of the king in March 1625. So that is it. They're the only parliamentary bodies that James calls during his reign. Obviously within those parliamentary bodies there are different parliamentary sittings, but really he only has 4 different parliamentary bodies, which shows that generally on the whole James wasn't necessarily willing to work with Parliament. He knew that they had to be there, but he much preferred to handle the show on his own and allow his favourites to handle the runnings of the country other than Parliament. So 2 things that you are now going to do independently. Again, this is a Word document. These are 4 different interpretations regarding disputes during James's reign. So each side of A4 focuses on a different factor. One argues that finance was the biggest issue during James's reign. One argues for religion. One argues for foreign policy, and another argues for attitudes. Give all 4 a read and think about which section you agree with most. What factor do you think really plagued James's reign the most? What factor do you think caused the greatest disputes between James and his parliaments? And then finally, little textbook, read pages 39 to 46. They again go over these parliaments that I've just discussed here, but they just give a little bit more information as to some of the key issues addressed in each of those parliamentary sessions and the reasons behind James's dismissal of those parliaments. So that's the last thing that you're going to do in terms of independent work. So pause that and do that now, and then I've got one last thing that I want you to look at. Okay, so I hope you can see this. If not, let me know and obviously I can email it over. So here are 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 bullet points that talk about some of the main reasons why there was disputes between the Crown and Parliament. So these are talking about some of the main issues that were formally addressed during the different parliamentary sittings and some of the issues that they caused. I would normally do this by printing it off and you could colour code it, but obviously we can't do that now, so you might have to be a little bit creative in terms of how you want to do this. Again, I suppose I could send you this and then you could colour code it using just PowerPoint. Yeah, I'll do that. I'll send you this PowerPoint so you can literally just colour code it yourself. So read through all of the bullet points. You're thinking about this here. You're not going to answer this question, but I want you to keep this in the back of your mind in terms of how you would answer it. So if you were to get a 20-mark question that said, during the reign of James I, financial problems were at the heart of disputes between Crown and Parliament. Basically, what it's saying is financial problems were James's biggest dispute between him and Parliament. Do you agree? So you're going to use this evidence here to consider to what extent you would agree with that. Also, bear in mind the Word document that you should have just read, where there's 4 different interpretations as well. Obviously, you've got that in the back of your mind too. Go through this and colour code it to highlight the causes of these disputes. So I've picked purple for finance, red for constitution, and what I mean by constitution, I don't know why there isn't a bullet point coming off that, because there should be, there we go. What I mean by constitution is rights and privileges. So rights and privileges of Parliament, because they do have parliamentary privilege, which is written within the constitution that they have to follow, but also prerogative of the king, because that's the grey area sometimes. The idea that Parliament have certain rights that they are legally entitled to, but then on the other hand there's the royal prerogative, which is kind of like unwritten rules that James believes that he can govern by, and that's where the situation gets a bit tense sometimes. Then yellow for religion, blue for foreign policy, and green for factions and favourites. So anywhere that brought any issues between sort of warring groups, any issues with James's favourites, that kind of thing. Work your way through and highlight the causes of the disputes, and then think back, what does it show? Does it show that financial problems really were at the heart of disputes, or does it show that actually it's other problems that we can see? So pause me now before I put my answers up. Okay, so hopefully this should have lit up like a Christmas tree on your screen. Remember, purple is finance, so I've got quite a few examples here of where finance did cause serious disputes. Impositions, we know that they were really controversial. Parliament complained that it was an illegal form of tax, whereas James argued that because it was goods that was being brought into his country, then he was legally entitled to collect impositions, and that got worse after the Bates case, where the judge ruled in favour of James and said that James could continue to collect impositions on goods such as currants and raisins. Impositions and James's collection of impositions caused complaints within Parliament, particularly in 16010 and 1604, but then this also breeds constitutional problems. Sorry, I've put J and Parl because I was conscious I couldn't squeeze it all on one screen. James and Parliament began to argue over rights and privileges. Parliament felt that it was their right to raise taxation, so whilst that is a constitutional problem, that is also talking about raising tax, that does also link with finance as well. They felt like their rights were being eroded. It is a parliamentary right to issue tax, and James was cutting them out and just doing it himself. 1604, Parliament wrote a formal apology and satisfaction to be clear on those rights. Again, you should have read a little bit more about that in the Word document earlier, but a form of apology and satisfaction was never actually presented to James. It seems as though they kind of bottled it right at the very last minute about actually giving James this document. It seemed as though they were fearful as to what his reaction would be. But again, that addressed their rights. That was talking about their constitutional rights. 1610, Parliament was dissolved by James over the issues surrounding the Great Contract, which was to do with money. Again, later down the line, the Aidled Parliament, Second Parliament, it failed to achieve anything. The biggest issues discussed during this Parliament were subsidies and abolishing impositions. James famously said about Parliament, "I am obliged to put up with what I cannot get rid of," which I think there highlights very well James's attitudes towards his prerogative. He knows that he can't rid Parliament completely. That's why he says, I'm obliged to put up with them because I can't get rid of them. But he also feels as though they are below him. They are a thorn in his side that he has to put up with, unfortunately. But again, main issues here tend to be factional divisions and infighting, poor management, that kind of thing. Buckingham becomes a real problem during this time period in the sense of whenever it was discussed within Parliament about James's use of favourites and Buckingham's position, which is becoming more and more elevated during this time period, James would become very upset at any form of discussions regarding that and would dissolve Parliament. James manages without Parliament until 1621. Next one, then, 1621, Parliament protestation of the Commons is presented to James. James gets so angry that he tears a page out of the journal and he dismisses the Commons over their issues. They feel as though their freedom of speech is being hampered, whereas James, on the other hand, feels upset because he thinks that Parliament is treading on his prerogative. So again, that's a constitutional issue. But what James is spitting his dummy out here is that Parliament were openly discussing the Spanish match and James's pro-Catholic foreign policy. James feels like his royal prerogative is being questioned, and actually foreign policy is a royal prerogative matter that Parliament shouldn't discuss. But big misunderstanding here, James had asked for parliamentary views on his foreign policy. I think, in a sense, again, you could argue that that was James being a mediator king, wanting to please everybody. But what he didn't sort of imagine was when you ask for someone's opinion, you have to be prepared to be criticised. It's like if you ask someone, "I've bought this new dress, what do you think of it?" There is a chance that they're going to say, "I think it's awful," or "You look horrible in it," and you have to be prepared for someone to say that. Whereas I think James just assumed that they would be supportive to his foreign policy plans, whereas we know that they weren't, and they were only prepared to give James money if he promised that he would embark on a foreign policy that they supported. So James becomes very upset about Parliament's handling of his foreign policy matters. 1624, Parliament did encroach on royal prerogative by discussing the type of war to be launched with their finances. So again, that's lots of different sections there. It's royal prerogative, so it's red, but it's also talking about type of war, which is foreign policy, and it's also talking about financing foreign policy, which is purple, including the appropriation clause and the grant of their subsidies. So again, this idea of, we'll give you cash, James, but as long as you only spend that cash exactly on what we want you to spend it on, James felt that was unfair. And finally, there is some evidence down here to suggest that actually there were also some well-managed and some effective parliamentary sessions during James's reign. For example, the parliamentary session after the Gunpowder Plot, James was granted very large subsidies, and also we see Parliament became slightly more supportive of James's policies, as long as they were anti-Catholic at heart. As well, in 1621, James is granted 2 additional subsidies. 1624, James told MPs that they may freely advise him on foreign policy, and he was granted 3 extra subsidies. In addition to that, although it wasn't enough, it was still more than he'd been given before. And then later down the line, just before James dies, he does accept the Monopolies Act in 1624, which is pushed forward by Parliament in order to support the Crown more with finances. So you can see here that it is a little bit of a mix. financial problems certainly do flow all the way through James's reign, from literally day one until the day that he dies. Issues to do with finance are certainly a stain on James's reign. But personally, I would argue that if you're thinking about the heart of disputes, what's the core problem here? The core problem is attitudes. It's this constant butting of heads to do with constitutional rights and parliamentary privilege versus the prerogative of the king. Fundamentally, Parliament and James just did not agree on James's role as king. And that is why, with money, with religion, and with foreign policy, they seemed to disagree at every single turn, which is why James becomes more hard in his attitude towards Parliament and more reluctant to call them and work with them right up until the very end, to the extent that by the time James dies and Charles inherits this Parliament from his father, it's a Parliament of MPs that are becoming radically more anti-monarchical and are becoming more aware of their own rights and more willing to fight for parliamentary rights, whereas what we see with previous monarchs in previous parliaments, they were much more willing to work with the monarch and for the monarch. By the time James dies and Charles inherits the throne, we have a much more toxic relationship between Crown and Parliament. So I personally would disagree with the statement. I don't think financial problems were at the heart of disputes. I think they certainly were important, but I would argue that actually constitutional rights, the prerogative of the king, and attitudes were the main reasons why there were serious disputes between Crown and Parliament. Thanks for listening again. I'll make sure I send you all of the stuff that you need for today's lesson, and I'll speak to you again later.